Hello Zimbabwe, welcome to the chair. My name is Tawanda Gudlanga. This week we are focusing on the education sector. It is very interesting that political parties vying for office in this harmonized election have been talking about education. While some have been talking about free basic education, some saying that they will be offering equitable quality education. How do we finance education, and what are the opportunities that come within the education sector? My guest this week is Mr. Maxwell Fomoyo, who is the Executive Director with the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe, ECOZI. Maxwell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Tawanda.
In brief, what is ECOZI about?
Education Coalition of Zimbabwe is a coalition of non-state actors that are in the sector of education, which range from various NGOs, INGOs, civil society organizations, CBOs, teacher unions, all those that focus on provision of education, either be it service or advocacy. So we are an umbrella organization, as it were.
Now, obviously, one of your issues has to do with lobbying. And currently, the government is said not to be contributing enough towards education, despite the fact that the biggest chunk of the budget is actually going towards the Ministry of Education. There is also what is known as the Dakar Agreement, where education should be funded by at least 30% of the total budget of every country. Why is there that particular gap?
I think there are a number of issues when we look at the financing of education in Zimbabwe. I hear so many people say when the budget is out, education has received the highest chunk, but this has to be looked at in a comparative way, because when you look at much of the budget that goes to education, it's simply talking of employment costs, because ordinarily we have the highest number of civil servants in the education sector. Off the cuff, we are talking of 130,000 teachers, excluding those that are non-teaching, that are still resident in the ministry. And we also have other ministries like the Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, where we have lecturers and other non-teaching staff. So ordinarily, when you look at the budget for education, the largest chunk of the budget goes to employment costs, which caters for about 98%. Yet we have about 9,000 schools that need to be financed through the same budget. So there is a lot that has to be done when we look at the financing of education, looking at the Dakar Declaration, where either 20% of the national budget goes to education or 6% of the GDP. We have been doing that. We have been giving over 20% of the national budget to as a country to education. But like I said earlier on, this has been going to employment costs. So we need to bridge the gap between provision of employment costs and capital expenditure, as it were. As you can, as you still remember, we have introduced many more schools after the land reform in 2000. And most of these schools are still either in bands or are still Paul and Dagger, as it were. And we need that kind of capital expenditure to develop these schools.
Has there been a definitive figure of how much Zimbabwe needs to invest in education in terms of the capital expenditure?
TAMSAC, the Minister of Education has established that they need 2,056 schools. So I think that becomes the basis at looking just at infrastructure. So then the costing can be done as to the cost of one school. But I think that is not the only thing that we look at. We look at the software that comes with learning, the teaching and learning materials in the backdrop of the new curriculum. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of provision of textbooks, in terms of provision of computers, because we want to go the ICT way. So definitively we don't have an actual figure, as it were, to say how much would it cost. There's been researches that have been carried by the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education together with the International Center for UNESCO, it has established the trends that are there in education. But what is more worrying is that in terms of our spending, we have a number of sectors in education. We have the infant, we have the junior, we have the secondary, we have the tertiary, which is broken into teacher education, into polytechnical, and then university. In terms of our spending, the teacher education and the university education are 15 times more as compared to the junior, which means we are spending much more in the higher education than in the primary and secondary in terms of comparison.
Now, let's talk about the models. What sort of models should Zimbabwe make or follow that help finance education? Because the scourge of HIV and AIDS was dealt with by coming up with an AIDS levy. Should we have something along those lines, a small syntax that will fund education in Zimbabwe?
If you had asked me that question 2 years ago, I would say, no, we don't need an education levy, but now I'm strong about it. Why? Because we are ring-fencing certain resources towards education. So the more we become determined to ring-fence certain resources, the better it becomes for us to realize that goal. So I'll agree for a national education fund.
Tell us more about National Education Fund according to ECOZI.
The National Education Fund will be a fund that equalizes opportunities to all learners in the schools. We have schools that have an annual income of about $300. We have schools that have an annual income of about 13 million. So when you create a national education fund, you start by equalizing the incomes of the schools, not necessarily at par, but on pro rata basis. Secondly, we have natural resources that can be ring-fenced towards education. For example, 5% or 0.5% of a chosen mineral could go to education or telecom services. So that could be a model that we can explore in terms of provision for education.
But when we talk about education financing itself and the need to ring fence some of our earnings or natural resources in order to finance, what would be the ultimate goal? Because you've spoken about the software, you've also spoken about infrastructure. What do we need to focus on as Zimbabwe?
When we get into schools, there are three things that are very important in a school, if not four. Is the teacher, is the infrastructure, is the teaching and learning material. So when we have those, so in terms of financing education, our focus is on the teacher, is on the infrastructure, and is on the teaching and learning material, ultimately to benefit the learner. So when we are financing education, we are focusing on those three components. So we have been struggling with 98% of the 20% of the national budget to finance teachers, and they are still not happy with that. So which means we are left out again with infrastructure and the teaching and learning materials. So we want to up the financing of the infrastructure in the teaching and learning material.
But how do we up the financing of infrastructure and learning material? Let's talk about it in the second segment. Join us there. Welcome back. This is The Chair, where we are focusing on financing education in Zimbabwe. It is said that there are a lot of opportunities that are in the education sector. And of course, Mr. Maxwell Rafomoyo, who is our guest, who is the executive director at the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe, believes that there is a lot more opportunities to come, particularly looking at learning material as well as infrastructure. Having said that, you said that already the teacher, there's been some form of focus on the teacher because 98% of the 20% that has been taken by the Ministry of Education is going towards teacher welfare, to teacher salaries as it were. But there is a huge deficit on infrastructure as well as learning material. There was a talk some point, I remember, where they were saying Zimbabwe textbook to pupil ratio was 1-to-1. So how come you are saying we still have a deficit in the material?
I think that was when we had a donation in 2011 from the donors through the Education Transition Fund, and to the tune of 52 million that was given to all the primary and secondary schools for the core subjects. But you may agree with me that there has been a curriculum change, and definitely the textbooks will have to change. Currently, the ministry has worked with UNICEF with the support of the Education Development Fund and the Global Partnership for Education to provide for something close to 9 million in terms of textbooks. But this focus has been to about 2,000 schools, leaving the rest, using some kind of criteria to choose those schools. So it means we still have a long way to go since we have a new curriculum rolling now. But what I wanted to say is, while we still say 98% has been going to the teachers, they are still complaining that it's inadequate. So it's inadequate, and we still need to push more in terms of
We'll talk more about the teacher, because I know this becomes very motive and understanding some of the perks and benefits that should be due to them. But let's look at infrastructure. What are some of the opportunities that may come when one decides to invest in infrastructure and education?
I would not want to answer on behalf of government, but I know the ministry, together with the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education, have been working on models of construction of schools, and I think they've gotten a loan from OPEC funds to the tune of constructing 70 schools in 2018, and they are going on to 100 schools in 2019. I think there's been a call by government to bring in churches who have ordinarily been supporters of provision of education. Most of our boarding schools are mission schools, and there's been a call that has been made to churches to provide more schools, and to individuals and to organizations to provide schools.
The reason why I'm asking this is exactly that education in Zimbabwe seems to be financed solely by government and some of the church organizations that you've alluded to. Why isn't there interest by interest groups like ECOZI and other stakeholders in actually investing in education as a way of financing education in Zimbabwe?
I think before we go there, the first group of people who have been very loyal and committed to financing education in Zimbabwe are parents. If you look at the research that was carried out in 2017, you'll discover that the parents had more contribution to education than the fiscus had. So we should not take away what the parents have done in terms of the fees and levies that are paid. But I will agree with you, from time immemorial, churches have been useful in terms of provision of education. A few other companies have constructed schools, a few other organizations have joined. Even our own members, I would want to highlight some of the members that have done very well in terms of construction of schools. I'll give from this angle organizations like Save the Children, organizations like Plan, organizations like Action Aid. Recently, even teacher unions were requesting to be given land to construct schools to help the government in terms
Would
of
that be in
construction
order? Because teacher unions are always known to lobby around the welfare of teachers.
I think the message that they were trying to bring was to say, let's put concerted efforts as a nation, everyone else, wherever they are, because of this huge deficit. Everyone should be focused on trying to build a school somewhere. I think that was the message that they were trying to bring.
Do joint ventures work, in your view?
They do. That's what the government is doing currently. They do, but that will also depend on the kind of interests that are being pegged by the ventures that are being done, because we don't want to mortgage other generations' future by selling them away on very high interest rates. So I think they do work, but we have to be very cautious in terms of what kind of interest rates are we attracting.
Do we have a choice as Zimbabwe? Do we have a choice in terms of the negotiation that should come out in these JVs?
We do. I don't think we can say the house is on fire, so we just pick anything as it comes. I think we do have a choice. What we need to do is to focus on the very needy areas in terms of the construction of the schools, and then we start off with those. That's why we're talking of a national education fund that then says how do we equalize opportunity, which is the most needy area, than to just do a thumbs up, so that we don't behave like the house is on fire.
But let's look at, of course, the whole issue around materials and learning, because you did allude to the fact that through some intervention from development partners, there was some money that was poured in. Now we are in the new curriculum, and I understand there is a serious gap and need for new material. How do we best deal with this issue?
In the circumstances in which we are, obviously the first port of call for us is the parent.
Who is already overburdened?
Who is already overburdened, which is what we are advocating for. Because when many people speak of the cost of education, they forget many more other hidden costs that come along with education. They think of levies and they say, oh, it's $15 levy. But there are many more other hidden costs that include teaching and learning materials, uniforms, food, and the like. So while we will still say the parent is our first port of call, that's why we need to be creative as a nation.
We need to be creative. Let's talk about it in the third and final segment as we talk about the role of the parent, as well as the forthcoming conference that will be dealing with ECD. Join us then. Welcome back. This is The Chair, where my guest is Mr. Maxwell Rafomoyo, who is our Executive Director of the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe. Our focus this week is on financing education and how Zimbabwe, as it is said that it is open for business, can actually benefit from investment in education. Now, you spoke about the role of the parents, who are also playing a big role in financing education. But we did allude to the fact that these are actually, the parents and guardians are actually overburdened. So what would be the alternative? Because some would say, let's run to development partners. Is that the way to go?
I think you agree with you that parents are overburdened because the cost of education is not only in fees and levies. There are hidden costs, which include the school uniform, teaching and learning materials, transport to school, food and the like. So they are already overburdened. But in its wisdom, the government in 2000 introduced the BEAM program. The purpose of the BEAM program was to act as a safety net to those children whose parents are finding it difficult to cope with the provision of education. But you agree with me, right now BEAM is struggling. So the wisdom in BEAM is to say we should create some safety nets that captures children who may be disadvantaged. So in other words, what we are saying is that before BEAM or before this period in which we are existing, there used to be what we called equalization grants. These were grants that were given to learners, and they were given in pro rata based on the type of school that the learner is, whether it's P3, P2 or P1 school. So this is the kind of mechanism that we are looking at, that over and above financing education to so as to provide employment costs, we should also have grants that focus at learners so that they can be provision of this teaching and learning materials.
But you do talk of BEAM, you talk of grants, the issue of efficiencies. Even if we are to pour in $1 billion in education, will it be efficiently financed to bring out that good and qualitative education framework in Zimbabwe?
I agree with you that until 2000 and I think it's 2011 or 2012, Zimbabwean education system did not have a plan as it were an education sector plan. But now the ministry has a sector plan from 2011 and the other one that was developed in 2016. And they have also improved in terms of data capturing and data management through the education management information system. So it is very critical to strengthen the EMI system, which is the education management information system, so that you can, the finance can then be useful. And there are also internal efficiencies in the education system that has to be managed. Like, for example, how many learners are in this cohort and how many are over 8 or under 8, or how many learners are repeating, and so on. The more we can manage that kind of information, the better it becomes in terms of efficiencies.
And of course, the emotive issue around teacher welfare, because a happy teacher is obviously one that brings about quality education. What is it that teachers really need in order for them to just have that smile on their face? Because we've had this debate all over, and some of the demands are said to be ludicrous.
I think teachers would need, obviously, when people listen to teachers, they would say teachers need more in terms of salary. But I think teachers would need good working conditions, which include tools of trade, which include access to modern technology, which include access to connectivity, transport, road network. We are talking of teachers who are in the breadth and width of Zimbabwe. So the more they are motivated in terms of tools of trade, they have everything that they need. They can access their cash, they can access their relatives, they have connectivity wherever they are, the more they become motivated.
But the big question is, what then should we say the teacher should benefit more than any other person? Because this is exactly what every basic Zimbabwean needs. But it seems like teachers need to have this sort of royalty status.
I don't think they are claiming for this royalty status. They are just a constituents who are clear in terms of what they want. If others want those and they are quiet, then it's not the problems of the teacher. They are just clear in terms of what they want. All of us may want that, then we should be saying that.
The new curriculum also came up with what is known as early childhood development. And we've seen the adoption of ECD as a key component of primary education in Zimbabwe. I understand that there is the first ever ECD conference. What are some of the objectives of this conference?
Yeah, we are planning to have an ECD conference on the 19th to the 20th of September here in Harare. Some of the major objectives of that conference is to discuss issues around, number one, what we have been talking about, the financing of early childhood development. If you were to go to the financing of education, you will discover that what the fiscus is financing so far in education is the teachers, who are even still in short supply in ECD. If I were to give you statistics, for example, in provinces like Matabeleland South, the teacher-pupil ratio in ECD is 1:121. So which means there is a huge gap in terms of teacher allocation at ECD. Yes, they talk about the provision of paraprofessionals, but these are ordinarily supported financially by communities who are again struggling. So it means the more affluent communities will manage. But if you look at that statistic, you also discover that Harare has a teacher-pupil ratio at ECD of 1:35. So already you see inequity in terms of the provision of ECD. So that's one thing that we are looking at, that there should be deliberate focus in terms of ECD provision and financing in the marginalized areas.
Okay.
Then the other issue that we also want to talk to is the issue of the comprehensive ECD policy. What we have are bits and pieces of statutory instrument 106, the director circular this, secretary circular that. So we want to have a comprehensive ECD policy that is cross-cutting, because ECD cuts across basically three ministries. The Ministry of Health and Child Care, because it has under 5s. the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education, and the Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, which is responsible for training of teachers who manage ECD. So that's one of the objective. And the third objective is to bring stakeholders together for networking and sharing the possible opportunities around ECD in this period of the new curriculum.
Do you foresee Zimbabwe, or what sort of timelines do you foresee Zimbabweans really coming up to speed in terms of the quality and the standard that probably as ECOZI you do envisage to actually reach?
We are doing quite well, as it were, because if you were to compare Zimbabwe in the southern region, in terms of our ECD, we have gone miles, because we are one of the first countries to train teachers specifically for ECD. We are one of the countries to have a national center for ECD, which is resident in Chitungwiza, the St. Mary's Early Learning Center. And you don't find this in many countries. But what we need to do going forward is then to strengthen that subsector by coming up with a very strong policy, as it were, and then to sort of cost this strategy going forward. I think if we do that, we are good to go.
Obviously, after the 19th of September, we would want to find out some of the issues that came out and the resolutions that you may have drafted. But of course, we wish you all the best as you continue to lobby for a better education in Zimbabwe. My guest was Mr. Maxwell Rafomoyo, who is the Executive Director of the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe, as we're focusing on financing education in Zimbabwe. As Zimbabwe is open for business in the new dispensation, to what extent are we going to see better quality education in the country? My name is Tawanda Gudlanga. Join us again next time. It is pleasant viewing.